Hello and welcome back to Custode Central. Today we're going to have a look at some soup options that you may want to consider when you're looking at army construction. So the first thing you want to think is, why would you want to soup into your lovely Golden Boy faction? So one of the reasons might be is you might want to add something that the faction just does not contain in its codex, or you might want to add something with higher efficiency. Obviously some codices have better units than others at specific roles. So if you do want to soup in something that is very, very efficient to replace something in your codex which is only so-so, that could be a good reason to do it. So I think a good starting point is to kind of look at your past games as to where you lost, because this will give you a better reflection of your actual local meta than somebody on the internet telling you what you should add into your list. So did you lose because your army was missing something? Did you not have access to good secondaries? Did you kind of not have enough range shooting? Did you not have enough board control? So then from there, once you've identified kind of a weakness in your list, you can start to think about what things your list would really benefit from with adding, especially if you soup. So we go back to, what do we think the Custodes Codex is lacking? So we don't really have cheap bodies to screen. Sisters of Silence can be, they are our cheapest kind of unit. They can be used to screen. I don't think they're really cheap enough to do so. Plus, they take up a very crowded elite slot in our army list. We don't really have cheap units for actions, which falls into the same issue as to cheap bodies to screen. And again, kind of our cheapest unit is probably a unit of sisters. We don't really have any sacrificial units. So when I think of sacrificial units, what I'm really thinking about are cheap units that aren't easy to kind of kill off with non-dedicated shooting, and they force your opponent to charge that unit in order to kind of finish it off. And this typically very often happens on a primary, where your opponent will put a very cheap but quite durable unit onto an objective. You don't have quite enough firepower to kill it off, or if you did have enough firepower, you need to use that somewhere else to get rid of a key unit on the opponent's side. And so as a result, you're forced to either let them score that primary, which could be worth 10 points as a swing if it gives them more objectives than you, or you're forced to charge it to either take it back with your obsec units, or to actually just kill it off. And that can open you up to shooting from the opponent or counter charges. So the fact that the Custodes army doesn't have a lot of these kind of units could be something that your army's lacking. Advanced deploy units or units that move before turn 1, they're super strong. So think about things like Serbi Raiders in AdMech, or the advanced deploy infiltrators from Space Marines, or Nurglings even. They just give you immediate board presence, and they force your opponent to kind of decide, are they going to try and kill Q units in your army, or are they going to try and kill your kind of advanced deploy units that are probably already sitting on objectives, or maybe screening you out very close to your own deployment zone. But to me, the kind of the biggest deficiency that matters, that comes up the most often, I think, is our lack of efficient high strength long range shooting. So it's got to be efficient. So things like, we do have some options. I just don't think they're terribly efficient. A lot of our kind of quote unquote high strength shooting is strength 7. So like the Elastus, yes, it's a good gun, but it's not a great gun, especially if you want to kill toughness 7 or 8. It's much nicer to have strength 8 or 9. And long range. So while we have access to something like salvo bikes, very often, even though you move 14 and your range is 24, it's not going to be quite enough on turn 1 or subsequent turns to kind of reach the targets that you really want to reach. You'll just be a few inches short, or you'll find that if you get the whole unit within 24 to be able to shoot, you're now within 22, 21, 22, 23 inches, which sounds quite far away, but there are enough units in the game that kind of move 12, can advance, and you're now in realistic charge range for the enemy. So that might be actually uncomfortably close for your salvo bikes to get into. So what does souping cost? So every time you soup, it means you're taking an additional detachment, and an additional detachment always means you're paying some CP for it. If you're very, very competitive and wanted to kind of rank up For the Custodes faction, in terms of ITC points, obviously you wouldn't want a soup. But one of the nice things is that the Custodes faction doesn't lose any special rules if you have a soup detachment. There are some other factions like Space Marines would lose doctrines, Admech would lose, I think, canticles, and Sisters of Battle, I'm not 100% sure what they lose, but they definitely lose something if they soup. So Custodes is a nice one to soup because you don't lose anything for your faction. So I'm going to give an example of a very small Astra Militarum patrol that you could soup into your Custodes list. So this is the Iotan Gorgonnes. These are a Scion regiment, and this is very cheap. This is 125 points or 130 points if you take a Tempesta Prime, and they have a special stratagem that allows them to deep strike within 5 inches for 1 CP. And obviously, being able to deep strike within 5 inches instead of 9 is a huge deal, because it means your opponent is never realistically going to be able to screen out their deployment zone for 5 inches. They could do it for 9, probably with a bit of difficulty, but it could be done. But for 5 inches, there's almost no chance that they're going to be able to do that. And if they do, they're going to leave nothing in the midboard, which will allow you to just run over their primaries. The other really nice thing is the objective marker. Is not like a point. It's like a small disc, and you have 3 inches away from that. So if your opponent is trying to hold an objective kind of on the edge of an objective, you can just drop in some Scions there. They're OBSEC, they deep strike for free, and now you can actually steal an objective while doing scramblers. So this could be a huge swing in games. So this is very nice and cheap. Doesn't cost you very much. Costs you some CP, costs you a few points, but it almost guarantees you scramblers. And I think this is a much more effective way of doing it than taking 1 unit of sisters and outflanking them, because obviously when you outflank, you can only come in from the board edges, and you have to pay CP for the outflank anyway, so it's not even that much more effective. So what's another kind of example of a soup detachment we could take? So in this one, this is again a patrol, and I would suggest Katachan or a custom regiment, taking Gunnery Expert as one of the traits. And the Gunnery Expert trait will allow you to reroll one of the dice for number of shots. So in this one, we'll take a company commander. It's very cheap. He has to be your warlord in this particular setup, but we'll give him no warlord trait, but he will get a free relic. And the relic I generally suggest is kind of Core of Aquila, and this will allow you to every time your opponent uses a stratagem, you can see if you gain a CP on a 5-up, max 1 per turn. And you could have 1 infantry squad. They're now I think 50 or 55 points following the latest update, and then you will take 2 full payload Manticores. And the nice thing about Manticores is they give you access to 120-inch artillery shooting, so you don't need line of sight, which basically means you will always be in range of anything you want to shoot on the board. And this will give you 2d6 shots. You can re-roll one as part of your custom regiment, and I've done some quick math on this. I need to triple check that I haven't done anything funny, but that will effectively give you 8.2 shots instead of 7. And these are coming in at strength 10, minus 2 AP, and flat 3 damage. And the flat 3 damage is the really key bit, because this will kill, Primaris, Grav, even tanks pretty good. So the chassis is a bit soft. It's toughness 7, 3-up save, 11 wounds. You have no invul save, so you are pretty vulnerable, but the fact that you have such incredible range and you don't need line of sight means it's very easy to hide these kind of towards the back of your deployment zone or behind some obscuring. And effectively, it's going to be very, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's problematic for the opponent to kind of get to your Manticores, which will mean you're quite likely to get 4 turns of shooting with these guns. And if you do get 4 turns of shooting with these guns, you've usually won the game, I want to say. So yeah, so this detachment will cost you effectively 1 CP, because now this is your warlord, so you get the detachment for free, and you pay the 1 extra CP for the additional tank case to have full payload on 2 tanks. What this does mean, though, is that you no longer have a warlord trait within your Custodes detachment, and you will not have a free relic in there, so you'll have to pay for a relic. One of the options you can take is Sergeant Harker if you do run Catachan, because Sergeant Harker allows you to reroll ones to hit within 6 inches of him. So if you're okay putting your Manticores kind of together, you can get good value out of that. And you could also think about adding another infantry squad for some additional screening. And the screening is really quite important when you run Manticores, because you want to make sure there's no deep strikers that can come in, or things like that, basically. So why are Manticores good? So the reason why I think Manticores good is they have amazing ability to alpha strike on turn 1, and that's before your opponent can get buffs off on the units, or any defensive buffs, psychic buffs, etc. And you can shoot things that are trying to hide turn 1. So think about all the times you've gone first in your games, and because your opponent's deployed kind of everything either out of range or behind some obscuring terrain, you actually don't have good shots on the targets that you actually want to shoot. So now with Manticores, you don't have to worry about any of that, because everything's always going to be in range on the boards that we play on currently, and you can't hide from this unit. All they can really do is get a cover save. They could be behind some dense terrain, or they could have some other kind of inbuilt buffs into the unit. But other than that, what this really allows you to do is it gives you full target ability over the army, and you can, if your opponent only has very few key units that you need to kill to kind of very likely win the matchup, you're able to target these with Manticores on turn 1. So it really allows you to get the full benefit of going first. And I often find that a lot of Custodes armies, they have good firepower, but it tends to be of limited range, and sometimes going first, you're not really able to bring it all to bear, so you don't really gain that much benefit from going first a lot of the time, depending on your army composition. And Manticores kind of helps even that out, and it really, once you start running Manticores, going first really does turn into quite a big advantage. And you have to remember, Custodes are people don't like to hear this, but they are a bit of a skew list, because effectively you don't really have to worry about AP0 weapons almost at all, because they're so inefficient when they're shooting against you, or even kind of AP1, because it's not that hard to get a light cover save against shooting. So all you're usually trying to do is prioritize units that have high AP, and that's kind of it. And if you can kill those, then you're usually home free. So I think they're very efficient in terms of damage output for the points, and if you shoot the right kind of unit, and the opponent doesn't really have access to defensive things that they can do to reduce your efficiency, you can sometimes just get your points back in one turn of shooting. Obviously, if you roll like a 10, 11, 12 on number of shots, and then you roll good on your hits, you're winning most things on 2s, some things on some harder targets on 3s. So if unless they're in some cover or something, they're unlikely to get good saves, and you can just start picking up models because it's 3 damage flat. The other nice thing is, you can create holes in the backfield if you want to set up deep strike for turn 2. So your opponent might deploy and have done a good job of screening out the deployment zone, but now you start picking units up, and now there's a hole. So now they have to decide, are they going to redeploy some units further backfield? That means there's less pressure in the mid board to contest objectives with you, or are they just going to leave this hole there and allow you to kind of do things? If you want to deep strike something in there, if you want to go for line breaker, if you want to go for scramblers, if you want to go for teleport hammer, for example, I think this is a very nice unit to consider for kind of units for armies that plan on deep striking. Nice thing you can also do is, sometimes you'll be fighting in the middle of the board, and your opponent will leave, like, I don't know, very, very easy units to kill, but they're behind obscuring terrain, and you have no way to get line of sight to them. Now with Manticores, you always have line of sight to them, because you don't need line of sight. So now your opponent is really forced to think about how many units they want to put onto a point in order to hold it reliably. And this will probably become more important in maps with less objectives, where losing one can flip who has the majority more often, rather than on like a 6 objective map or something. So this can be a really nice thing to do. The other thing is it makes itself a high priority target for kind of anti-tank fire, which will take pressure off your units. And once your opponent sees how much damage that these can do in a turn, they will usually be making some sort of plan to try and take out the Manticores, because very few armies can take 4 full turns of shooting from two full payload Manticores. So they'll they'll be trying to push in all the way into your deployment zone in order to get angles or to get in range for these shots. And this can obviously be beneficial for a Custodes army, because you really like to be in kind of a mid to close range engagement where, you know, most of your guns are in range, and obviously Custodes are never going to do terribly in close combat. So I think it's adding Manticores is kind of a win condition in itself, because obviously if you can keep them alive, you just do so much damage throughout the game that it's very hard to come back from. And the Hunter Killer Missile is a nice addition to full payload Manticores, just because it'll max the damage on it, so you'll just get automatic 6 damage if you do manage to hit and wound and go through the armor save. So what are some weaknesses when you run Manticores? So one of the weaknesses is, because the ballistic skill is 4+, if you have to shoot at something that's -1 to hit because it's in dense cover, or it has it's under the benefit of some aura or some buff like that, you're going to be hitting on 5s instead of 4s, and that's like a 33% reduction in your output immediately. So if you have a choice, try and shoot at something that isn't going to be -1 to hit. The other kind of thing is that it's only AP2, and AP2 is usually good, but there are now a growing number of targets that become not so efficient to shoot with Manticores. So things like Terminators that start with a 2-up save, and then they take Storm Shields, they go to a 1-up save, and now they're sitting in light cover, so they go to a 0-up save, and now suddenly your -2 doesn't seem so good, because now they'll be saving on 2s now. So this is obviously not an efficient target, but it is kind of nice because there are quite a few units in the game which have invul saves. If a unit has an invul save, they will be paying for that, and if you can push their armor save to the same as their invul save, you're usually in the sweet spot for efficiency. It can be good. It's not so good at shooting into full wound models, especially if they're very cheap. So I wouldn't waste them on things like Nurglings, really. Really try and go, turn 1, try and really take out the key units in your opponent's army. That's kind of their win condition. It's another weakness. Soft chassis, yeah. So it doesn't take much to destroy or bracket a Manticore. And another thing is, even though you may be all the way back at your deployment zone, if your opponent is running kind of like a flyer, flyers are very quick. They can, they'll be able to get close enough, and they'll be able to get line of sight to your Manticore if they want to. Might be suicidal for them, but it's probably a very good trade. And obviously, trying to shoot a flyer turn 1 because they're innately -1 to hit, it's not so great. But there aren't too many flyers in the game that have good anti-tank weapons, or rather, you don't see them too commonly. So I think it helps a lot to have at least some screening units. So especially in the meta now, where most armies, or not most armies, a lot of armies are relying on kind of melter guns, which are kind of 24-inch range to get their anti-tank done, and 24 is sometimes not, it's just not enough. Their units can't move fast enough, or they don't do well on their advanced rolls, and they're just not going to be able to hit the back of your deployment zone turn 1. So that can be nice in terms of just using distance as a shield for your Manticores, trying to keep them safe. We're not kind of in the meta where previously, everybody was running 6 to 10 las cannons with 48-inch range. So now against some lists, you can really just use distance as a shield there. The missiles are blast, so that means it's really, really important you don't get tagged in combat, because now you can't shoot your blast weapons into combat. What this means is it'll prevent your Manticore from firing, and not only that, you can't even fire into the combat that you're in. So you're very likely to be perpetually tagged into combat, because you could fall back, but then they'll just move and charge you again. So that's not very good. And the other thing is, if you do get a deployment where you're not that far away from your opponent, and so you really need the line of sight block in terrain, the Manticores can eat kind of deployment space where you would want to put your Custode unit, which can be problematic sometimes, but it's probably worth it to try and have your Manticore survive the early turns. So what are the key stratagems to think about when you're running Manticores? So Relentless, you spend 1 CP at the start of your turn, and this allows you to use the top profile. It's going to be super good. Jerry rigging, use it at the start of the turn, heal while wound. This is obviously better than Relentless if you are just 1 wound off top bracket. Direct onslaught, this is pretty situational because usually you don't want to have direct line of sight, but if you happen to have direct line of sight, you can spend 1 CP and you get +1 to hit with your Manticore missiles. It's not going to affect your heavy bolter or your hunter killer missile if you have one, but this is a very significant improvement. Hitting on 3s instead of 4s, it's like a 33% improvement in output. Defensive gunners lets you overwatch on 5s. Obviously, you're still going to have to pay the additional CP to overwatch itself, but this can be pretty nice if you just need to get one kind of exactly 1 wound through onto a key target that's charging your Manticores in the late game. Vengeance for Cadia. This is a crazy stratagem. If you face chaos, never forget that you have this, and this allows you to reroll all hits and all wounds in shooting or overwatch against chaos, and obviously your efficiency is going to go absolutely through the roof here. So things like Magnus turn 1, point that at them before they get their buffs off, or Keeper of Secrets, or basically anything. Things will melt when you use Vengeance of Cadia. And also don't forget the command reroll for 1 CP. So you'll innately get to reroll 1 of the dice out of the 2d6 if you're Catachan or you took the custom regiment for Gunnery experts. And if your other dice roll is also poor, you can very strongly consider using a command reroll there in the shooting phase. So here's a sample list using kind of Manticores and Scions. So this is a list that I've played a few times. I think it's quite stable. It's probably not the best, but it does give you some nice options. So this is a Shadowkeeper's Custodes patrol with a shield captain on Jetbike with a Hurricane and the Auric Aquila for the 3-up invul and the reroll charges. 5 shield guard, 5 Sagittarium with Misericordia, so they can fight if they get stuck in combat. 5 prosecutors, just to have some additional kind of units on the board and a bit of psychic defense. 1 Vex with the Magnifica for the -1 reduction to hit in shooting, because obviously this multiplies very well if you're taking a lot of shooting damage, which you will do as Custodes. And a Castellan Axe. Let's fix this typo. And the Castellan Axe allows you to redeploy before turn 1, but after you know who gets turn 1. So you could do this in 2 ways. You could deploy very offensively, hoping you get turn 1. Obviously it's 50-50, and if you don't, you just move your units back, or alternatively you could deploy defensively and then move them up if it turns out you are going first and your opponent is deployed in a way which allows you to really capitalize on this and get a nice alpha strike off. And obviously this in conjunction with Manticores it can just be brutal against some armies. 5 salvo bikes with Misericordia. Misericordia I don't usually take on bikes, but I think in this list I just had the points. And 5 Venatari with Misericordia. Usually if I have points, I think Venatari benefit from Misericordia because they do tend to get into combat, and the extra output is nice. And obviously Venatari I think really by far the best unit in the game. So you should always be thinking, does your Custodes list start with at least 1 unit of 5 Venatari? For your soup detachment, you're just going to take the company commander. They are going to have to be your warlord because how you get 10 cases and full payload is a 10 case characteristic. You forego taking a warlord trait on your actual warlord in order to do this. And they'll get Kurov's Aquila, so every time your opponent uses a stratagem, you gain a CP on a 5-up, max 1 per turn. You get 2 units of Scions. And this will just innate, they deep stroke for free, so they will give you access to deploy scramblers very easily. And if it's not a matchup where they're going to do that, it can be nice just to have some screening on the board. and then the 2 payload Manticores. So again, this will give you very long range indirect fire. You can peel your opponent off objectives if they try to be greedy and hold things very, very cheaply. You can really punish them for that on primary, or you can kill just the key unit in your opponent army that they need to have alive. You know, what is their win condition. So this will give you good access to engage, especially if you do use the Scions and Deep Strike, because you can put them in whichever corner to help you do scramblers and get a maximize engagement on all fronts. Grind them down is still pretty good, even though you've now kind of opened yourself up slightly by taking these 2 units of Scions. Banners is good because you have the infantry units if you need to, and you know them having doing action is absolutely fine. They're very, very cheap. Scramblers obviously, and then you just pick into your what other secondary that might be available. So after this, you can think, what else could you add? So if you don't have Scions with your Manticores, you can always think about just adding some Scions. If you took an infantry platoon instead, gives you a few more bodies to screen out your backfield, or against things like you know, eradicators that are trying to come in from strategic reserve from the flanks. It's not that hard to screen them out, especially if you have some obscuring terrain to help you cut off some of the angles. And so yeah, I think this is a nice and easy combo. And again, with Astra Militarum, you don't lose any kind of special rules for souping. But also now let's look at another unit which I think is pretty good. Probably the second best unit within Astra Militarum, and that are tank commanders. So what's a tank commander? Tank commander is basically a Leman Russ that is an HQ slot and a character. And they have access to grinding advance. It's the same as the other Leman Russes. So the Leman Russ will move 10 inches, and grinding advance means if you move half or less, you get to shoot twice. So they're ballistic skill 3+ instead of 4+, because they're tank commanders, and they will generally be giving themselves an order in the shooting phase to reroll 1s to hits. So their chassis is toughness 8, 3 up, 12 wounds and no invul. So you know they're not so vulnerable to small arms fire, but they are pretty vulnerable to things like melter guns. So my preferred loadout on these are demolisher cannons. These are only 24-inch range. They have D6 shots, strength 10 though, very nice. -4 AP. No, sorry, -3 AP. Which is pretty good, and D6 damage. Now, obviously, with grinding advance, you get 2 D6 shots. If you take Katachan or the custom regiment, you're going to get to reroll 1 of the dice for shots, which is pretty big. But again, we run into the problem that 24 inches is sometimes just close enough to actually be charged in 1 turn if your opponent has kind of fast units, double move units, fast units that can advance and charge. So now the spotter detail custom regiment becomes very nice, because it will add 6 inches of range to any weapon that is 24 inches or more. So now you have a 30-inch range, and typically at 30 inches you are safe from most units in the game. You know, unless they're very specialized, they have warp time or something like that. And I would say you might be looking at kind of the tank ace traits for tank commanders and think, oh, that looks nice. And some of them are pretty good. But typically, I think full payload is best left on the Manticores, because you can only take 2 tank ace abilities in an army. If you can avoid it, I would say don't make your tank commander your warlord. That's only to avoid being vulnerable to cut off the head, because obviously, even though it's a character, it does have more than 10 wounds, so you don't get lookout sir from this. So if your opponent does somehow have a way to shoot this unit, they just kill it turn 1, you'd be giving up quite a lot of points. So that's the reason I don't generally recommend taking 3 of them. Plasma sponsons are an okay option to add firepower, but obviously you're now putting quite a lot of points into 1 model. So you'd have to make your assessment as to that. I think I probably have to do a bit more testing before I come to a firm conclusion on that, but I generally don't take the sponson weapons. And hunter killer missiles they're pretty good on tank commanders. They're much better than on other vehicles, because obviously you get to reroll 1s, and you get ballistic skill 3 instead of 4. So what are the key stratagems for tank commanders? Relentless again. Start of the turn, you can use top profile or jerry rigging, heal a wound. So if you're just one wound off top profile, this is just better. Defensive gunners allows you to overwatch on 5s. Vengeance for Cadia is again very, very good. Rerolling all hits and all wounds is just amazing. This is incorrect because you can only benefit from one order at a time. Hail of Fire. This is a very, very key one. This costs 2 CP, but when you shoot at a vehicle, you don't roll for number of shots. You just do maximum shots. So doing 12 shots at strength 10 minus 3 damage 6, hitting on 3s, rerolling 1s is going to put a dent in most things, if not kill it. And again, the command reroll if you ever need to reroll the number of shots for the second die. So this is an example of what a battalion of this would look like. So again, we have the company commander with the warlords, but no warlord trait. You get your free relic, Core of Zaquilla for the 5-up CP gain from your opponent spending using a stratagem, and you get 2 tank commanders with demolished cannons. Take an infantry squad, take 2 Scions, so you can also do scramblers if you want, or have screening if you want to take on a map that's good for banners, and 2 full payload Manticores. And yeah, this comes up to about 855 points. And I'd probably suggest adding 1 more infantry squad for screening, because the screening is kind of important here, because you don't want units getting too close to your key units, which are going to be your Manticores and your tank commanders. You really want to keep these alive as long as you can, and if you can do so, you've got a really good shot of kind of tabling your opponent, or forcing them to concede early, just because you've just killed everything. So how does this Astra Militarum battalion play? So the things you have to prioritize are, because this is now quite a significant investment of points versus a cheap and cheerful super detachment, kind of affects the way that your armies plays. So you are going to have to play a bit more defensive. So you need to really make sure that you don't get your tanks tagged in combat, because they all have blast. Not being able to shoot with them for a turn is very, very significant. And you want to try and screen out your tanks so they can't be charged, or they can't get in the melter bonus range. So that's all pretty important. And I'd say in the early turns, definitely prioritize killing things that can damage your tanks. So that will be, units with very strong guns, or very fast units that could actually manage to get into combat and tie you up. So I think this battalion's actually pretty good as a standalone. If you're playing Astra Militarum, I think if you're playing pure Astra Militarum, I would just add some Bulgarin to the list to have a bit of a close combat ability, and some really sturdy units that can really contest an objective in close combat. But obviously, if you're sweeping with Custodes, I think they're better than Bulgarin, just because you have OBSEC as well, and you have access to such good stratagems. So again, yeah, I'd say I wouldn't focus too much on the primary in the early turns, and I'd try to keep your focus on keeping your tanks alive and just doing excessive damage to the enemy army, and trust that in the later turns they will have so little left that they won't be able to contest you on objectives, or if you want to spread out all over the map to maximize your points with engage, for example. What's another example of a soup detachment you could take? I've had a play around with the Super Heavy Detachment with Imperial Knights. So the Armiger Warglaives drop 20 points in the FAQ, which I think is very nice. So now if you take them with the multi-gun, they come out to 140 points each instead of 160. So this is going to run you 3 CP and 420 points. And obviously with the change to bring it down, this used to offer 9 points for bring it down, but now it only offers 6. And obviously 6 is, if these are the only 3 vehicles in your list, this is free. Your opponent's not really going to take bring it down against you, and if they do, you're kind of fine with that, because they can only maximum get 6 points for killing these 3 armigers in your list. So if you don't know what they are kind of Lords of War, and they're basically the mini knights, but they're not Titanic. So they move 14, and they've got a decent gun. It's a 30-inch with ballistic skill 3, assault D3 shots, so you can advance and shoot at -1. They're strength 8, -4 AP, D6, and then obviously the additional melter gun that you pay for is range 12, assault 1, strength 8, -4, D6 damage. Now with the thermal lance, you can roll 2d6 and discard the lowest if you're within half range. That's 15 inches. It's not unlikely you're going to get in that range, and you get the new melter rule for damage with the melter gun, which is d6 plus 2 within half, but obviously getting within half is a much harder thing to do. They come on a pretty sturdy chassis, toughness 7, 12 wounds, 3 up save, 5 up invul against shooting. Weapon skill 3, they get 4 attacks, but these are at strength 12, -3 AP and flat 3 damage, so that will kill a lot of units really. Or they can use a sweep attack at strength 6, -2, 1 damage flat. So if you get stuck in trash with like orcs or guard or even even against harlequins, this is pretty good because now you don't have to worry about their invul saves, and they will have 1 wound anyway. You're just trying to kill as many models as possible. So so because these are 3 Lords of War, but there's no Titanic units, the Super Heavy Detachment's only going to run you 3 CP. Just because of the way that knights work, one of your Warglaives will become a character for the Knight Lance rule. This does potentially open you up to assassinate, but it will also mean you get to heroically intervene because it's a character. You will have to pick your kind of allegiance. You can choose Quaestor Imperialis. This will give you +1 to advance and charge. But I think my preferred one by quite a big margin is Quaestor Mechanicus, and this will let you regain a wound at the start of the turn. Now you might look at this and think it's not so clear that really gaining a wound at the start of the turn is better than +1 to advance and charge, but really it's the reason for that is the access to the stratagems, because the allegiance will lock you out from some stratagems that you'll want to use. So you can choose one of the normal household traditions, but for this particular detachment with 3 Armiger Warglaives, I like to do a custom one. So the one that I do is Aggressive Persecution, so that means you can reroll a single dice when determining damage in Overwatch, shooting or fighting. In fighting it's not going to be relevant because you don't roll any dice for that, but it is pretty nice for the Thermal Lance or the Melter Gunshot. And also Glorified History lets you reroll a single hit roll for a model in Overwatch, shooting or fighting, and this is actually pretty relevant because your ballistic skill 3 you will miss sometimes, and being able to reroll one of these misses is pretty nice. It'll increase your efficiency by quite a lot with the model. So what are some key stratagems for Armiger Warglaives in my mind? I think the key ones that spring out to me are rotate Iron Shields for 1 CP, and this will give you a 4-up invul save against shooting. Noble Sacrifice is situational, but can be nice. That's 2 CP. You now explode on a 4-up instead of a 6-up. So if you are surrounded by a lot of units, especially key units that you're trying to kill and they're on 1 or 2 wounds left, doing some mortals there could be pretty huge. Pack Hunters, I haven't really used it, but I suppose it could be nice to get a bunch of rerolls. So after you make a successful charge with 1 Warglaive, models within 12 inches of that will get to reroll failed charges. Full Tilt 2 CP, you can advance and charge. Typically you would use this on a much bigger knight like a Gallant to get like a lot of value from the CP. Obviously the Armiger is okay in combat, but you don't typically think it's worth 2 CP to do it. However, it is quite a durable model, so if you can charge something that is very shooty and it's unlikely to kill you in Overwatch or combat, being able to turn off its guns is a pretty good deal. So this gives you kind of flexibility and increases your kind of threat level to your opponent army. Now we come to the 2 stratagems that you don't get access to these stratagems unless you are Quaestor Mechanicus. So this is why I strongly prefer Quaestor Mechanicus. So the first one is Benevolence of the Machine God, that lets you ignore mortal wounds on a 5-up for the phase. And the nice thing about this is you only have to use this once you take mortal wounds. So if you don't know how many mortal wounds you're going to take, and let's say you get smited, you just take 1, you might just ignore that. But if you know there's going to be a lot of psychic at you or some other form of mortal wounds, then then yeah, then being able to ignore them on 5-up is very good. But the other key one is Machine Spirit Resurgent. That's 1 CP at the start of the turn, and that just lets you use top profile for the turn. So this is obviously big because these units do degrade, and because they start on 3+, they will degrade to 5+. So flanking maneuver, you can auto advance 8 if you end up within 12 inches of a board edge, but you can't charge after this. So this can be a nice way if you're just short of getting somewhere for engage on all fronts, and you think these points, this point is worth the CP, or it can get you into range of shooting your guns, because obviously they are assaults, so you can advance and shoot, although at -1. So how does the detachment play? So I think the main thing about this is it adds some ranged anti-tank, anti-monster to the Custodes list. And the really key thing about this is the 30-inch range. So you might think 30 is not that much more than 24, but as I discussed, it kind of is a big deal because it gets you out of a threat range, whereas within 24 inches you can be within a threat range to be countercharged or shot by other stuff. So generally you'll play these units very aggressively. They'll take up board space. It'll set you up nicely for engaging all fronts, and sometimes you might not be used to playing so aggressively with units because you tend to play Custodes pretty cagey in the early turns, but sometimes this can set you up for a nice counter charge. So let's say you get onto an objective and your opponent comes in, they move and they charge into your unit. It's not the easiest thing to kill. It will probably do some damage back, and it can set you up pretty nicely for a counter charge if you have units coming up behind it that might be a bit slower, because obviously the Warglaive moves 14. So it's also credible melee threat versus almost everything apart from really, really tough units in melee. So you wouldn't want to get charged by really heavy assault units because you don't get the invul save in melee. But most things will not want to be in combat with an Armiger Warglaive generally. So you've got some potential to be tar pitted by cheap units with a 4 win profile, because obviously it's not efficient to use your 3 damage one. And you have to go to your sweep attack, and your maximum damage output reduces from 12 to 8. But yeah, so this is just something to be mindful of. If you get stuck with scarabs, it's not the most efficient place for your unit to be. And I would expect these units to die because they're not that hard to kill, because they're toughness 7. You don't have access to Grim Responsibility because they're not Custodes units, and they only have a 5-up invul against shooting, which is significantly worse than a 4-up. So I would expect them to die, but they do have a lot of wounds, and that means they are taking firepower away from your Custodes units, which can be a good thing because now you get to turn 2 and turn 3, and your other key units aren't dead, or you have more units, you have more models in the unit than you would otherwise do. So I think it's a good kind of spot to look at the opportunity cost of 3 Warglaives. 2 kind of comparison units. 3 Warglaives is 420 points and 3 CP. 2 Caladius is 450 points, and 5 Salvo Bikes post change is now 425 points. So with the bikes, you get 5 full win models, toughness 6, 2-up save, 4-up invul. They move 14, but they're only range 24. So this is only, in my mind, it's only really just enough. We would really, really benefit if these guns were a bit longer range, but obviously, we're not here to ask Games Workshop to change rules for us. The hit-on-2s, real wins versus vehicles, very nice. But they get access to good stratagems. So, Grim Responsibility, using the Vex Magnifica, Transhuman, reroll 1s with a Shield Captain, or even wounds with Trajan and Archaeotech Munitions. So the additional benefit is this is a very excellent unit in combat, and it is additionally obsec. So if we think about spending the points instead of on bikes on Caladius, you only get 2 14 win models. And this is toughness 7, 3-up, 5-up, and so these move 14 as well. And you do, but the benefit here is you're really paying a massive premium for the fact that you get very long range with these guns, And if you just look at the damage output, it doesn't look very good as a comparison, right? But there is something to be said to have long range guns, because if you have a good gun but you're not in range to shoot anything, you might as well not have a gun that turn. And obviously damage done in early turns is worth much more than damage done in later turns, because whatever you kill in turn 1 on turn 2 isn't doing damage back to your army in subsequent turns. So these are hitting on 2s, and if you've got the heavy blaze cannon, you'll reroll wounds versus vehicles, and you get access to the strength strat and -1 and reroll 1s. But you really have no combat ability. But it's not the worst thing in the world if you get tagged in combat, although it's not good because you won't have target choice. But you're not blast, so you're not gonna be completely out of action. Now let's compare this to 3 Warglaives. So here you get 3 12-wound models. So I've highlighted this because this is pretty big. So this is 36 wounds now for 420 points versus 20 wounds on bikes, or 28 on the Caladius. And this really amps up the durability of your army by pushing a lot of additional wounds onto a chassis that's not really hard to kill. I mean, it is not easy to kill. So this is actually pretty similar to a Caladius, but obviously you're getting 36 wounds versus 28 here. So toughness 7, 3 up save, 5 up involve versus shooting, 14-inch move again, although obviously you don't fly, which is a nice benefit with the Salvo and the Caladius, and now 30-inch on your thermal lance. And you know, it's only 6 inches, but sometimes 6 inches is all you need to get in range on turn 1 to hit a key target. So this is the kind of shooting output from that. So obviously they're not as good as Custodes because they're hitting on 3s instead of 2s. But if you take the household traits, you can re-roll one of the dice for hits and re-roll one of the damage rolls. So I think this kind of evens it out a little bit. It's not going to be as good, but obviously Warglaives are also good at fighting. You get 3 separate units, so they can be in different places on the map, and you can force your opponent to kind of overkill a unit. So if you're on like 3 wounds left, and they've got a squad of, I don't know, let's say Eradicators, you know, they might be, you might incentivize them to try and kill the unit off, because otherwise you're going to use Machine Spirit Resurgent to act on top profile for the next turn. So they might have to dump a lot of firepower into killing, you know, a 3-wound model, whereas if they were just shooting into a unit of bikes, obviously they don't lose any efficiency by, you know, by trying to kill, you know, the rest of the squad. Obviously you get some benefits from, you know, if you have a model with 1 wound left or something like that, but it's pretty nice to be able to be in multiple places at one time instead of having the points concentrated in one area. And you get access to rotate iron shields, which will give you a 4-up invul. Advance and charge can make you a threat to some shooting, kind of heavy shooting units that don't want to be in combat and would lose a turn if they had to fall back. And you can obviously operate on top profile, and they're pretty good in combat against most units. So you may recall when we did the anti-tank, anti-monster kind of shooting analysis on efficiency that the Pallas was a really very good unit. It's got very good output for its points. It's really fast, helps you get engaged on all fronts, lets you tag a primary on turn 1, and if your opponent doesn't have fast units, they just can't contest you on that, which means you'll score massive on turn 2. And it can definitely help you in anti-tank and anti-monster shooting. But the thing with the Pallas is it eats fast attack slots, and I think fast attack slots are also it's a very crowded area, because I strongly believe every Custodes army should take at least 1 unit of 5 Venatori, just because they're by far the best unit in the codex. We'll probably do a separate video just on Venatori and how good they are if you still are unconvinced, having tried them using superior fire patterns. But if you haven't tried it, please do try it. But yeah, we'll do that in a separate video. And I generally think most lists should be taking at least 1 unit of salvo bikes as well. So as a result, if you're running a patrol, you don't actually have any fast attack slots to take Pallas. If you're running a battalion, you probably have 1 slot left to take 1 Pallas. Yes, it can be good, but it's probably not going to be enough. I've typically found that when I was taking Venatari, Sagittarium, and a unit of bikes, it was usually just enough ranged firepower to deal with some lists, but sometimes it just wouldn't be enough. And I don't think the addition of a Pallas would be enough additional firepower to solve the problem that I was having. So if you want to get more Pallas, you could take 2 more if you take an additional patrol, but again that's going to cost you 2 CP. If you now change your patrol or your battalion to an outrider to get access to 6 fast attack slots, that's going to cost you 3 CP anyway. And I landed on the conclusion that taking 3 Warglaives is kind of better than taking 3 Pallas, just because you get more wounds, they're sturdier, and they can also fight. So this is a sample list with Armiger Warglaives. So you'll see a lot of repetition in my kind of Shadowkeeper's patrol. Just this is kind of a reflection of what I consider a stable core of a Custodes army to be. So here we have a shield captain on bike with a hurricane. I think the hurricane's nice for certain matchups where, you know, towards the end of the game you might want to be clearing some trash off an objective before you charge onto an objective. So you only have to kill 2, 3, maybe 4 units, 4 models left. So you can just take that completely. And it's also really good against stuff like Harlequins, where you're quite likely to get in combat with that, instead of an additional kind of melter shot. Strategic Mastermind is nice, lets you recycle CP on a 5-up when you spend CP, and your standard kind of 3-up invul reroll charges, and the 5-up Feel No Pain for the Warlord trait. Take 5 Shield Guard, they're really good to hold like an objective. If you need to hold an objective that's not behind line of sight, or has any cover, you know, a 1-up 3-up unit, pretty tanky, and they're able to absorb a charge, which is another kind of key concept that I think I'll cover in a future video. Sagittarium and Misericordia, standard backfield shooting, prosecutors, good to have an additional unit. It's infantry for raise the banners. It's good for kind of psychic defense, and you can scramble with them if you absolutely have to. And Vexilla with a spear and Magnifica. -1 to hit is generally always good value. 5 salvo bikes with Misericordia. I think here I have the Misericordia just for points, and 5 Venatari with Misericordia, and this is pretty standard. And then you have the 3 Armiger Warglaives. So the benefit of the Armiger Warglaives is it's a very balanced unit. It doesn't skew you towards melee only or shooting only. It can do a bit of both, and because the Shadowkeeper patrol is also already pretty balanced, this is just kind of a nice way to buff out the patrol. And again, the key thing as the reason why I take these is not so much for the combat ability, but the fact that it gives me a lot of wounds on a tough profile, and the 30-inch range on the thermal lance, because I typically find the reason why I lose some games is I just didn't have enough long-ranged, high-strength shooting. So Warglaives will definitely give you some, get you some durability with wounds, and you can treat this kind of as a threat overload, because if you're running 3 Armigers up the board and you've got the bikes and the Venatari kind of being a bit more cagey behind them, making themselves less attractive targets to hit with, you know, terrain or obscuring or a Vex, or, you know, just access to stratagems, it means you're going to have your key kind of win conditions, which are probably your bikes and your Venatari, arrive in turn 3 with more models in the unit, which is very nice. So this will give you good accessibility for engaging all fronts, grind them down, banners, scramblers sometimes, if you're willing to outflank the prosecutors and you don't need them for psychic defense. And then usually you're fishing for another secondary, which might be a kill secondary, or might be the mission specific, or something like that. So it's not a perfect list by any means, but I do find this list to be pretty stable. And we've come to the end of the video, actually. So thanks very much for watching to the end. If you like the content, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks very much.